Hi everyone. This week we're going over Chapter 7, which focuses on social class and the structure of inequality. So we need to understand inequality. Despite rhetorical claims about equality of opportunity for all, America is a profoundly hierarchical society with the benefits and rewards of living here unequally distributed among its people. Consider how the images here illustrate the vast difference between the circumstances of the upper class, which is shown on the right, and the poor, which is shown on the left. Sociologist Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, highlights the challenges faced by poor families when it comes to securing stable housing, which is a disadvantage that wealthier families are unlikely to experience. So we have social stratification in our society. Every society has some form of social stratification, but different societies stratify people according to a different criteria, such as race, class, and gender. It's the division of society into groups arranged in a social hierarchy. It persists over generations and is maintained through beliefs that members of society widely share. In a stratified society, groups at the top of the hierarchy have greater access to goods and services than members of groups at the bottom. We find several different systems of stratification operating in the United States, where it is not hard to demonstrate that being wealthy, white, or male typically confer a higher status, and all that goes along with it, on a person than does being poor, non-white, or female. Because social inequality affects a person's life experience so profoundly, it is worthwhile to examine how stratification works. So, as mentioned earlier, we do have social inequality in our country, and it is the unequal distribution of wealth, power, or prestige among members of a society. One system of social stratification is a caste system, and this is when status is determined by one's family history and background and can't be changed. India is the country most closely associated with the caste system. Another example of a caste system would be the apartheid, which is the segregation of racial and ethnic groups, which was legal in South Africa between 1948 and 1991. South Africans were legally classified into four main racial groups: white, who were English and Dutch, who had English and Dutch heritage; Indian, from India; colored, a mixed race; and black. Blacks formed a large majority at 60% of the population. These groups were geographically and socially separated from one another. Blacks were forcibly removed from almost 80% of the country, which was reserved for the three minority groups, and relocated to independent homelands similar to the Indian reservations in the U.S. They could not enter other parts of the country without a pass, and if they did get a pass, it was usually in order to work as a guest laborer in the white areas. Ironically, African Americans visiting South Africa were given honorary white status and could move freely within both non-white and white areas. So, as I mentioned before, apartheid is an example of a caste system, and it's the term for the system of segregation of racial and ethnic groups, which was legal in South Africa between 1948 and 1991. Law professor and civil rights attorney Michelle Alexander argues that there is what is similar to a caste system in the criminal justice system of the United States. I'm probably going to get rid of that slide. We also have social class, which is a system of stratification based on access to resources such as wealth, property, power, and prestige. And sociologists and psychologists often refer to social class as socioeconomic status, or SES. I have put on Blackboard a little quiz that you can take to determine your class. It might not be applicable to you. It's based on cultural capital, and so it could apply to you, or it could apply to just simply your tastes or how you were raised. And I think it's kind of fun to see what characteristics would be labeled as working poor or middle class or upper class. Additionally, another concept that we need to know of is intersectionality, which identifies how different categories of inequality, such as class, race, and gender, how they all intersect. So, being white you usually have a lot of privileges, but if you're a white and a male, then you have more privilege than white females. And so I know this is a confusing concept, so I've provided an intersectionality video on Blackboard for you to watch. And the woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, is actually the one that introduced this term and used it to define how various inequalities can interact with each other and impact individuals differently. So we have social class in the United States. We have upper middle, lower middle, and working poor. So I'll go over each of these in the next few slides. The upper class consists of the wealthiest people in a class system, and they possess most of the wealth in the country. It makes up 1% of the U.S. population. So that means that 99% of the people in the United States are not from the upper class. We have the upper middle class, which includes professionals and managers, and they make up about 14% of the U.S. population. So total, upper and upper middle takes 15% of the whole population in the United States. That means that the rest of us are not going to be in those classes. We have the middle class. Most people actually usually associate themselves with the middle class, and these include white-collar workers, and it has a broad range of incomes, and it makes up about 30% of the U.S. population. I just find it interesting that most Americans would call themselves middle class, regardless of whether they make $25,000 or $250,000 per year. So middle class seems to be a social norm that people want to identify with, even when they really are not part of that class. Because we all can't be a part of the middle class if only 30% of the population makes up that social class. We also have the working or lower middle class, and those include blue-collar or service industry workers. It includes members that usually don't have college degrees, and they also make up about 30% of the U.S. population. Lastly, we have the working poor and the underclass. The working poor include members who work manual and service jobs and seasonal employment, and they make up about 13% of the population. The underclass members are likely to be employed only part-time or are completely unemployed, and they only make up about 12% of the population. So here are all of the classes. We have upper middle, lower class, working poor, and underclass. And I like this figure because it tells you the percentage of people that are in each class, and it kind of gives you a breakdown of money and, occupations that they would have and typical education. So when studying for the next exam, I would definitely reference this graph because there may be questions about, the differences between the classes. So now that we've talked about the social class of the United States, we're going to talk about the theories that are associated with social class. This is going to be a common theme throughout the semester. We've already seen this with deviance. So now we're going to look at social class, and conflict theory is the first theory that we'll go over. Again, Karl Marx is the one associated with this theory, and he believed that there were two main social classes in capitalist societies. We have the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, and they owned the means of productions. And then we have the workers, or the proletariats, that sold their labor for wages. So Marx believed that classes would remain divided and social inequality would grow until a revolution occurs. So remember that Marx was a conflict theorist, meaning that he was interested in the conflict between these two classes, the capitalists and the workers. He believed that eventually the workers would revolt against the capitalists because of the oppression that they felt. We also have Weberian theory, which offers a similar model that also includes cultural factors. So it's not just based on money, it's also based on prestige. So he argued that the class status was made of three components: wealth, power, and prestige. Wealth, or privilege, is a measure of net worth that includes income, property, and other assets. Wealth might be considered money and investment earned or inherited. Power is the ability to impose one's will on others. So power could be political power or the ability to make changes in the system. Prestige is the social honor people are given because of their membership in well-regarded social groups. So prestige is the social honor that people are given because of how well-regarded they are. Sometimes a person may have one of these components, but not others. But often, the most powerful or successful people will have all three. They'll have wealth, power, and prestige. And sometimes this model is referred to as the 3 Ps, or the three-pronged image of power. So if we look at social prestige, because prestige is different from wealth, and there are some jobs that have more prestige than others. So we can see that, physicians and lawyers and professors have the most prestige, and they are white-collar occupations. And we can see that most of the blue-collar occupations are actually lower in prestige. So this has a lot to do with not only income, but also type of occupation, because more than likely a janitor, a waiter, or an auto body repairman is not going to make as much as a physician or a lawyer or a professor. So there is a connection between social prestige and income, and with that is usually power. Now that we've examined conflict theory and Weberian theory, which is kind of an offshoot, we're going to talk about structural functionalism and how it relates to social class. Structural functionalism suggests that the system of stratification that has emerged in society is actually functional in many ways. They say that there are certain roles that are more important for the functioning of society, and these roles may be more difficult to fill, so more incentive is needed. Greater rewards are necessary for work that requires more training or skill. So this perspective kind of helps us explain the existing system of social stratification and its persistence. But it still leaves us with the questions about the structured inequalities that the system continues to reproduce. So if we think of it, we're going to need people to take our trash somewhere. We can't just leave it everywhere. We're going to need people to make food at fast food restaurants and cut the meat at Kroger's. And so even though these are blue-collar jobs or maybe white-collar jobs, they serve a function and they're very important. But ones that require more education are usually the ones that receive more money and more prestige, such as being a lawyer or a professor. There is structured inequalities, though. So, for example, is it really functional for social rewards such as wealth, power, and prestige to be unequally divided among members of society? There is good reason to believe that a garbage man is just as important as a professor. Otherwise, we'd have garbage all over the streets and all over our homes and our yards, and it would ruin our earth. So they are important, and they do deserve to be, given prestige for that. Another theory of social class would be postmodernism and social reproduction. More recently, Pierre Bourdieu attempted to explain social reproduction, and he said that it's the tendency for social class status to be passed down from one generation to the next. So that means that, if your mom is wealthy and your dad's wealthy, then more than likely you're going to be wealthy too. But if your parents are both poor, then it's more likely for you to become poor as you grow up too. So while we like to believe that our society has an open system in which people have social mobility, we can notice that patterns lack inter and intergenerational mobility. So the main point here is that we tend to notice trends where children reproduce their family social class. They also looked at cultural capital. According to Bordeaux, social class status is passed down because each generation acquires cultural capital, which helps people gain advantages in society. And cultural capital can be defined as tastes, habits, expectations, skills, and knowledge. So if we have, the tastes of wealthy people and we drink wine instead of beer and we go to operas and listen to classical music instead of listening to rock music, then we have a higher cultural capital. And so cultural capital can either help us or hinder us as we become adults. For instance, it's very helpful for business people to know how to play golf because many important business deals are struck on a golf course. Growing up in a family that can teach you how to play golf can give you some cultural capital that will be very advantageous to you. Stepping away from postmodernism, we look at symbolic interactionism and its ideas about social class. And symbolic interactionists examine the way in which we use status differences to categorize ourselves and others. As Erving Goffman pointed out, our clothing, speech, gestures, possessions, friends, activities, and more provide information about our socioeconomic status. So you might notice that you wear similar brands of clothing or eat at similar restaurants as your friends. You'll also notice that there are other people who wear or eat things that are very different from what you wear or eat. These preferences may say something about the class that you belong to or associate with. And then, it's just kind of like how Goffman talked about our on-stage and off-stage. When we're on stage, we really want to show that we belong. So even if you belong to, or if you're a part of the working poor, you're still going to try to buy clothes that most middle class people would wear, or try to obtain cars that are similar to what the middle class would have, just so that you can present this lifestyle and show others that, hey, I'm not a part of the working class, I'm actually a part of the middle class. And that's us trying to influence how others perceive us. So essentially what this whole lecture is about is to say that belonging to a certain social class has profound consequences for individuals in all areas of life. This includes family, health, education, work, income, and even the criminal justice system. So we need to think about which people in society tend to have greater access to these resources. Not everyone has an equal chance of getting into Harvard University, being operated on by the best surgeon, or even becoming the President of the United States, despite what children are told in school. People also tend to marry those whose social and cultural backgrounds are similar to their own, mainly because they are more likely to meet people like themselves. However, there is social mobility. It's not very often, but it does occur. And social mobility is the movement of individuals or groups within the hierarchical system of social classes. There is a closed system and an open system. A closed system is one in which there is very little opportunity to move from one class to another. But an open system is when there is ample opportunity to move from one class to another. The United States technically has an open system. It is legal and permissible for people to move between classes, but we can also notice structural patterns where people tend to stay very close to the class in which they were raised. So I wonder, if we have an open system, why do we see a lack of opportunities to move between classes? That's something that maybe you should think about. And it's not a discussion question. There are no discussion questions this week, but think about it a little. I'd love to hear your opinions on it. So if you'd like to email me those answers, feel free. Other types of social mobility include horizontal and vertical. So, horizontal social mobility is the occupational movement of individuals or groups within a social class. So, this type of social mobility is actually fairly common, and so we change jobs. But both jobs are in the same class. So, for example, a therapist who shifts careers so that he can teach college experiences horizontal mobility. He's not going, therapists and college professors both share the same class, which is typically upper middle. If a garbage man decides to work at McDonald's as a waiter, then that's also horizontal social mobility because he's not moving up or down the social ladder, but he's staying in the same class. Vertical social mobility is the movement between social classes and, depending on the direction, is often called either upward mobility or downward mobility. So this is when you move up or down the ladder, and that's why it's called upward or downward mobility. If the same therapist that I was talking about earlier marries a president of a large corporation, then he may experience upward mobility. But on the other hand, if he or his wife gets laid off, he may experience downward mobility. People are actually far more likely to experience horizontal than vertical social mobility. And most Americans strive for upward social mobility, but it's actually unlikely to happen. The last subject that we'll talk about this week is poverty. In the United States, the federal poverty line, which is an absolute measure of annual income, is frequently used to determine who should be categorized as poor. The poverty threshold for a family of 4 in 2019 was $25,000, or about that. In 2017, 12.3% of the population, or about 40 million people, were considered to be living in poverty. Most people that live in poverty are not unemployed. This fact is evident in the term working poor. Individuals living below the poverty line are eligible to receive assistance, so they have, thanks to the welfare reform which occurred in the 1990s under President Bill Clinton, we are now able to have certain benefits. There is a book, though, $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America, and Eden and Schaefer, who wrote this book, they discuss their findings regarding welfare benefits, which have declined significantly while the number of individuals living in absolute poverty has actually increased. This graph represents poverty in the United States by race, age, and sex. Blacks and Hispanics, more Blacks and Hispanics are in poverty than whites and Asians. Whites are actually the least likely to be living in poverty, so only 8% of the population live in poverty. Age, those that are under 18 have the highest poverty, followed by ages 18 to 64, and then 65 and older actually have the least amount of poverty. Males are less likely to be living in poverty than females, and this kind of correlates to job opportunities. There is sexism in, the work. There can be sexism in the workplace. So males are often typically hired more so than females, and the same applies to whites, especially with those more prestigious, higher income jobs. So there is a culture of poverty. The culture of poverty refers to learned attitudes that can develop among poor communities and lead poor people to accept their fate rather than attempt to improve their situation. One of the key criticisms of the culture of poverty theory is that it tends to blame the victims of poverty for their own misfortune while failing to take into account the structural factors that shape that culture. However, it is worthwhile to discuss ways in which society might help stop this cycle. For instance, if children aren't acquiring skills for financial management at home, could the schools intervene and give these children the skills that they'll need to move into a higher social class? There's also an invisibility of poverty, which kind of makes it hard for schools and teachers to address this issue. There's residential segregation, political disenfranchisement, and the use of law enforcement to control the homeless, which can make poverty invisible to many Americans. And then we also have this idea of the American dream, which I touched on several times throughout the semester so far. And the American dream is the ideology that anyone can achieve material success if he or she works hard enough. This ideology explains and justifies economic inequality in our social system, and it has been criticized for legitimizing stratification by implying that everyone has the same opportunity to get ahead. It's the idea of meritocracy, that hard work justifies rewards. So if you work hard, then you will be rewarded. And this notion tells us that people are responsible for their own success or failure. But in reality, we know that there are structural advantages and disadvantages that contribute to an individual's success or failure. In upcoming chapters, we'll discuss some of these structural issues like gender and race. The American dream is exemplified in the U.S. society by rags to riches success stories. Although it was once pervasive, younger Americans have begun to reject this ideology. A 2015 Harvard University poll revealed that among college-age millennials, 50% believe the American dream still exists, and 50% believe that it's dead. There are also differences in belief across racial groups. The simplicity movement is a reaction to this ideology. It encourages people to work less, oppose consumerism, earn less, and spend less, placing less value on materialistic goods overall. So it's also important to talk about the wealth gap, which indicates that the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. And we also have oligarchy, which occurs when a few very wealthy individuals rule a country. And so we can kind of see that in the United States, since 1% live in the upper class, and that 1% has billions of dollars, while the rest of us may be scrounging around trying to get a good job just to pay our car payments. Alrighty, everyone, so that's everything for this lecture on social class and social inequality. You should finish reading Chapter 7 for the week and complete the inquisitive quiz, which will be due Sunday by 11:59 p.m. There is no discussion post this week, and looking ahead, you can start reading Chapter 8 if you'd like. And just as a warning, there will be a discussion post next week, so don't forget to participate in that next week. Have a great week, everyone.